you've ever been to an AA meeting, you know this. If you're someone there, I would say, my name is Jordan Gruber, and I'm an alcoholic. In that moment, they're bringing the part of the person that is an alcoholic present, front, and center so that it can be acknowledged and worked with and supported. Now, by contrast, if somebody goes to a therapist and their husband or wife or partner has busted them for getting drunk all the time and they go, the part that's the alcoholic usually doesn't show up in the therapist's office right away. They have to get comfortable and they have to work with it. So that's why AA is so, effective. It just brings the person into that part of them right away.
Okay, so let's go back to the ultimate takeaway here. So you've got this piece of multiple selves within all of us, and we're not going to discuss how many multiple selves because that's kind of individual.
Everybody has a different number of selves for sure.
But I'm going to take myself as an example, okay? So I'm very comfortable in the fact that I'm a natural introvert. However, my work forces me to speak in public or deal with the public. And so when I am preparing for a seminar or a workshop or a class or something even, on the radio here, there's definitely a different type of energy or enthusiasm or attitude that I step into. How is this not a conscious choice in regard to our mood? How is this something that I'm playing a little devil's advocate here, okay?
Oh, that's fine.
So how is this not us stepping into a choice of saying, okay, I have to be more extroverted, so I'm going to step into the side of my personality that I know very well exists, as well as my introvert that exists as well. So is that something of more of an awareness of our multiplicity, or is that a choice? Is it a mood? Explain that to me.
I don't think it's a mood. I think you get it exactly and 100%, and you're already doing this, and you actually just described exactly how and why you do it, and you've known this about you for a long time.
Okay.
And whether or not, you just heard that a friend died of COVID, or, you just got an unexpected $10,000 IRS check, 15 minutes before we were going to go live today, you were still going to put on your professional persona with me. And,
right,
and also,
right.
Let me just say the words we use. John Rowan was a British psychologist who wrote a book, The People We Are, in around 1990, which actually we agree with a lot of. And he came up with this list of 25 different names for subpersonalities, and started out by saying, well, if there's comfort in numbers, this sort of shows that this idea is everywhere. Well, by now, of course, our list is 75 terms or so, and that's just English. One of the big points of the book is that if we're right about this, if there is an assumption, and what we call it in the book is the single self assumption, that you are or ought to be a single self, if that assumption is wrong and you take it away and you look, then you would expect to see multiplicity, healthy multiplicity even, nearly everywhere in language and culture and philosophy and religion and in neuroscience and in postmodernism. And in fact, you do see it. You see it in tons of 19th century novels like The Steppenwolf, or, there's just so much of it out there. But we have been told for so long that this is not a realistic possibility. And, to be fair, Western philosophy has a long tradition of essentialism, going back all the way, that says you're one thing and that's it. What makes a thing is its essence, right? That's all. It's very Platonic and even Aristotelian. But at the same time, you have Plato, speaking for Socrates, giving us two different sets of a self model for the human being, the passions and the intellect and I forget what they are exactly, but so these ideas are not new. It goes back a long way, and it really is everywhere. But because, and there's, like I mentioned before, there's all these other systems where people, have done a lot of work on this, but yet, as a general cultural notion, really taking seriously that you're not just as one self, but that you have different selves, it's a big shift for a lot of people, and a lot of people, a lot of our readers say they feel a lot of freedom and a lot of openness to embracing all of the different parts of who they are. They have permission to be all of who they are, and that makes a huge difference for them.
Sure, because like you said earlier, the way it's been portrayed so much has been a little bit scary. I mean, no doubt, you've got Sybil, you've got the swirling head, you've got the multiple personalities. Right.
Hollywood loves to take things and make them super crazy. But the other part of Hollywood that's interesting is that you also find this idea showing up in shows like Star Trek and in BoJack Horseman and The Big Bang Theory. We weren't able to include screenshots of any of those because the studio said no. But like these kind of concepts, almost explicitly stated, very similar to how we are, it's kind of bubbling up everywhere. And it's even bubbling up in academia, and they're calling it something similar is called intersectionalism, which basically says you have to stand at the intersection of all of the different lifelines that someone has as, a student and a child and of a certain sex and a certain race and everything they've been through to really be able to understand them. And so sort of similarly, to really understand someone, you need to kind of get a pretty good picture of all their different selves.
And what does this relate to the single self assumption? When we talk about that in your book, what did you mean by the single self assumption?
Yeah, the single self assumption. This is, Jim and I play different roles in this book, right? He's been thinking about it for a long time. I first met him in 1990 when he was giving a lecture on this very topic. And even back then, he was formulating this notion. So, if there's a breakthrough here, it's that Jim, on top of the work that all these other people have done, was able to formulate this idea that there is an assumption that is pervasive throughout our entire culture and our language and our religion and all of the, self-growth and personal growth workshops. The assumption is that ultimately you ought to be, that it would be better to be, that it's supposed to be a single self. That's the only thing that makes sense. And what we're saying is that that's great, except as we have an anecdote in the book about Freud and Jean-Martin Charcot when Freud was his student. And Charcot responds back, theory doesn't prevent facts from existing. The fact is we all have different selves. And we have created this entire convoluted way of using dissociation as a concept and trying to explain all these things that is very much similar to, you've probably seen the Ptolemaic worldview and Epicycles and how back in the 12 and 1300s they were starting to get astronomical data that said, well, it doesn't really work to have the Earth at the center unless we do this. And then we're going to add on this other cycle, and they called them Epicycles, and they came up with these fantastically complicated diagrams. And then, of course, it was proven that the sun was at the center, and many things simplified. So what we're saying is that when you realize that your single self is not at the center of who you are, but that you're a constellation of different cells that come in and out and have different strengths and that change and that share things, it really is a paradigm shift in Thomas Kuhn's sense of the word. It's such a simple and obvious idea, and a lot of people already know this is so, that it's hard to explain it. And so the single self assumption kind of gives you a little key. It's a seductive invitation. If you can suspend the single self assumption for 5 minutes or an hour and go around, your day and say, what if I'm not really a single self? What if there are these other cells of me that once I shift into them, they're going to have, a different agenda and a different way of doing things? Am I willing to actually experience how real this is? And the interesting thing about it is that one of my old philosophy professors immediately objected that this whole idea was incredibly complex and completely violated Occam's razor, the law of parsimony, to explain things as simply as possible. Right. And we say, no, I can explain so many things about human behavior. This is the simpler answer. I can explain why you have a great first date with someone that even leads into a full-on amorous thing, and then the next morning you kind of don't even know that person, don't want to be there because you were in a different self and you're not in that self anymore. Whereas my old teacher, the late Bill Eichman, said when I said, no, I'm going to wake up at 6:30 every morning for the rest of my life and meditate. And he looked at me and laughed and said, yeah, but the you that is making that vow is not the you that will wake up. It's kind of that simple.
That's right. Now, in that piece of self-awareness of our multiple selves, it also kind of like, makes us have to step up to a lot more responsibility about our self-analysis and self-awareness, wouldn't you say? I mean, in understanding and accepting our multiplicity, we're also accepting, hey, we have flaw, we have these urges, we have these needs, we have these wants. However, in, cultured society, these things aren't, conducive to living in a healthy way. So would you say that it brings us to a point of kind of like stepping up into our highest self, our best self? Does it give us that opportunity?
Okay, so now you see what you just did there, right? You see what you just did there. You want to create a best self or highest self. And when you look at some of these systems, let me go on here. I'm being devil's advocate now, my dear. When you look at a lot of the systems that are out there that are very famous and very successful and have been working with this for decades, including internal family systems and psychosynthesis and I think voice dialogue, I have to look. At the end of the day, each one of these systems wants to create or get you to a high self or a conscious self or a super self. In the book, we call it a super self captain. So we're not saying that such things don't exist. We're just saying that's above our pay grade, and that's not the pragmatic level that this analysis is existing on. Because if you try to establish and have this high self that you can always connect to no matter what, you're not going to be able to. You're going to have a set of selves, a symphony, a constellation. And in fact, there's an incredible book called The Minds of Billy Milligan, written by Daniel Keyes, who wrote Flowers for Algernon, which everybody knows. So the book is a psychiatric and police record in extreme detail about this guy, Billy Milligan, who had 23 different personalities. And this is one of those cases where one of them had super strength, one of them learned Serbian-Croatian 19 from a book, even though he was an uneducated guy from, the Southwest. He didn't know anything. One of them was a very fine artist, portrait painter that people, when he was in prison later, would pay tens of thousands of dollars for. And, he had these very remarkably different selves, and the way they switched back and forth, and there were two of them that decided which different selves got to be basically in the driver's seat or in front. Now, there's a moment in the book where one of his selves, which is called the teacher has seen all of the other selves and knows everything about him, and even made it possible for Billy to first start talking to a psychiatrist when they figured out how he was constructed. But then an event happens in the book, and the teacher gets frightened and runs away and has no idea how to deal with it. It's not a regular self, even if it's real. So, I agree with your basic point, because you realize that you do have different cells, and you can even create new cells that you can step into. And we're back to David Bowie. We have a great illustration of 6 different Bowies in the book that Helen Green gave us. And you look at Sasha Fierce, and you look at, lots of different people have recognized that they've got to sort of dive in and step into that other part of who they are. But, you might, you've been at spirituality and self-development and psychology for a long time, and perhaps you have established a permanent real-time connection with your high self. There do seem to be people who sort of do that, but, typically when we hear that, we'll say, well, tell us, what's your high self's favorite restaurant? It's a different order of being. It doesn't, you don't shift in and out of it unless you're, in a long, retreat or doing psychedelics. It happens, of course, and there are people who are spiritual geniuses, and that becomes perhaps their main self, but the one they're most frequently in.
All right. So in the fact of our multiplicity, and there's going to be, where a myriad of emotions, feelings, thoughts, and actions. So we're not looking at judgment. We're not looking at judging our multiplicity. We're not looking at judging our multiple selves. But in our multiple selves, say we are maybe aware of different, I'm afraid to even say